Good evening. Thank you for joining us. It is beautiful outside, and you chose to be in here with us, which we're very grateful for. This is now the fourth meeting of the ASE Vision team, I believe. I'm going to be handing the microphone over to John Peacock here in a minute. I wanted to thank everybody for coming tonight, and John is going to set the context, and we're going to be spending the next 3 hours with you. We will give you a break. So with that, John, do you want to?
All right, welcome everyone. I really do appreciate you being here on such a lovely spring day. We have not enjoyed many of them to this point, so the fact that the sun's out and you're here is greatly appreciated. Tonight, we're going to take a little bit of a turn from the conversation we had on the 29th. The 29th was really about our passions, our stories, our hopes for where we want this project to go. Tonight, we're going to be doing a lot of fact downloads. So there's going to be a lot of data tonight. There will be a quiz at the end with, just kidding, no quizzes. It is going to be a lot of information. So there is plenty of coffee in the back if you need caffeine or sugar to get yourself through. Please help yourself to it. But the facts contribute to the story, and really there's two kind of levels of data and demographics that we're going to be talking about tonight. So much of our conversation relates to concerns about growth and what growth has happened in our community and how does the airport fit into that. And so we're going to have one speaker really talking to us about demographics. They're going to be talking to us about what's happened in our community over the past 20 years and what does it mean for our future. So it's not necessarily about the airplanes or employments or those sorts of things. It's really about what's happening, what has happened and what is happening in this valley so that we can put this, the infrastructure decisions that are ahead of us into a context. The second part of the presentation then is really going to focus in on the airport itself, and we've received a lot of questions over the course of the first few meetings about what is happening at our airport and what are the trends at our airport in terms of operations, total aircraft operations and employments and that sort of thing, and how does it relate to how we might forecast what's going to happen with the demands at our airport. So we're really going to spend our time this evening going through those things. So our meeting purpose tonight, really to explore those potential implications of forecasted industry changes in service, what's happening with aeronautics, aircraft fleet and airspace from a regional growth and management perspective. Talk about establishing that baseline of past and present air service and what our current conditions are at Aspen-Picking County Airport. And then finally, to better understand the projected future trends in the air service industry and how those might affect what's happening in our community. So tonight I'll be introducing our two speakers. Most of our time is going to be spent with these two speakers, setting this context for growth in the Roaring Fork Valley, and then really, as I've been talking about, changing over to really talk about air service and aircraft and fleet mixes and airspace. We'll then have an opportunity, as we have had in all of these informational meetings, for a moderated question and answer. You guys tend to surprise us, so that will give us some more homework for future meetings. So tonight's speaker. Our first speaker is Gabe Preston from RPI Consulting. Gabe's been in the business for nearly 20 years as a planner and economic analyst. He's led over 200 projects. He's worked a lot in our community, and one of the reasons we wanted to bring Gabe here today was his familiarity with our valley and with our community, and looking at the demographics and the economics and those sorts of things. You can see from the slide that Gabe has a master's in geography from the University of Colorado in Boulder and a BA in mathematics and philosophy from St. John's College in Santa Fe. Linda Perry will be talking to us tonight about the air industry itself. And Linda comes to us from Leigh Fisher. She's been in the industry for 34 years, specializes in economic analysis, aviation demand forecasting, and comparative evaluations of airline services, route networks, and airfares. So you're going to see a lot of where Aspen-Picken County Airport fits in, both regionally but also nationally into the air service system. As you can see, she has a bachelor's in economics and government from St. Lawrence University and a master's of economics from Boston College. Before we bring our speakers up, just a couple of announcements. We want to do, I'm sorry, I was getting ahead of myself here. Please visit asevision.com meetings for all upcoming meetings and materials. We do have a few. Thursday, June 6th is the next large meeting, and that's where we'll be doing breakouts with our groups again. We'll be working with our committee leadership to identify any presentations and such. The Community Character Working Group, if you're on that working group, there is a meeting Thursday, May 23rd at the Picken County offices from 4 to 6. You'll be receiving a notification about that, and please check the website. Also, we do have opportunities for airport tours. Not everyone has done those, I know, and so please take advantage of those. Monday, May 20th from 2 to 4 p.m. and Thursday, May 29th from 9 to 11 a.m. We are limited to 8 people per tour. Please contact the airport, John Kinney's office. John, can you shout out your number real quick for me?
We've got sign-up sheets in the front.
Oh, we've got sign-up sheets in the front, I'm told. Okay. So if you have that, and if you can't make these times, if a weekend time or such would be better, maybe make a note on those, and we'll see if we've got enough people interested. We'll accommodate that. So, without further ado, we're going to get into our speakers and the data. The first part of our presentation is really setting the growth context and what's happening in the Roaring Fork Valley. I'd like to introduce Gabe Preston from RPI Consulting. So, Gabe, it's the down arrow.
All right. Thank you, John, for troubleshooting the shooter. So, mentioned a little bit that I'm familiar with the area. It's actually really rare. I mean, there's only 2 communities that I can both be a consultant in and have lived there, and this is one of them, and Durango's the other one. It was back in '98. I actually worked for Picken County Community Development I know I was here for 4 winters. So somewhere in between 3 and 4 years, and it's good to have that experience. I lived in a little cabin in the middle of Ashcroft ski area. The Royal Cabin is no longer there. It was the Savile Ryan's cabin when I first moved in there, and so I have this understanding of why people are so passionate about this place, but I'm telling you, I'm amazingly objective as well. I have to be for my job, and so that's what I'm going to do this evening is really show you. It's mostly trend data and sort of snapshot data that helps us understand how what is the nature of all the activity that's going on here, and And you'll see as we get into it that it's somewhat difficult to get exactly at the phenomena and the things that that generate all the activity up in Pickens County. So we use indicators. We have to sort of use indicators to indicate the amount of activity that's occurring. So that's really the nature of my part of the talk tonight. I always like to start with jobs because jobs, as an indicator, reflect both. These are people, right? So anytime there's a job, that means there's actually somebody working that job. There might be a job opening, that doesn't really get measured. The job is actually somebody working an actual job. So it relates to the population, but it's also an indicator of economic activity. If your business is flat, you're not going to hire somebody. If it starts to get busy, that's when one hires somebody. So, you see job stats all over the place, but it's kind of interesting to break it down. One thing that we learned, and I always kind of wondered about this, is that Pickens County, Aspen Snowmass Village, not recession-proof, right? So you can see that jobs peaked, one of the other thing that we learned is that it's kind of a delayed reaction, that like a recession will hit the U.S. and we don't feel it for a while. It'll still be cooking. All the projects that were going, whatever was going on will kind of continue, and then it's a couple years later, that's when we start, like when the rest of the nation seems to be recovering, that's when we start to fully recover. Now, it's not all the way true, but you can see here that jobs peaked out in 2008, sort of slowly declined to a low, around 2010, and then slowly grew again at about 1.2% per year. So quite a bit of growth there. That's a few hundred, like before 2008, that's a few hundred jobs new per year, and then after that, it's about 230, 225, something like that. I would characterize that as moderate growth, and particularly after in the recover period, after we sort of bottomed out post recession. One of the things that we know about Pickens County is that the way housing units are used is different than in a traditional economy, and so one of the ways to look at that is, let's compare housing units to households and look at that over a long period of time. And so there's a big gap here, right, between households and the total housing units. This is not the case in kind of a traditional economy like, Littleton or Aurora or something, or Centennial, where your households are going to be a lot closer to the number of housing units that you have. So there's a big gap here, and we know what that is. That's part-time residences, vacation homes. It's all the kind of other ways that homes get used in Pickens County here, other than as a place for full-time residents to live. But the important thing to note here is that the spread maintains, it's about the same. Like the relationship between total households and housing units is kind of holding over time. And so another way to look at that is to look at the vacancy rate. And, vacancy doesn't mean vacancy here in Pickens County. It just means in fact, the way that Department of Local Affairs, our demography office through Department of Local Affairs, calculates that is it's the ratio between the number of households and the number of housing units. So that ratio, what that looks like, that's one of these indicators for how much of the housing stock is being used as part-time residences. We think from a 2006 study where Northwest Cog drilled in, they did two different methodologies. Where one, they did a survey where they surveyed a whole bunch of residential dwelling units, 1,200 or something like that, a pretty decent survey, and then they looked at assessor records and tried to match the physical address with the address of the owner and where those didn't match. So they actually came up with, they think that, they back then said, hey, second homes are about half of the housing stock. And that's probably true. It's probably, that percentage is probably a little bit higher than what we're showing for the vacancy rate. But I still think that the vacancy rate is the indicator that shows us which direction this is going. And basically, we're right back to where we were in the 80s. So, and there was a little bit of a spike. So, in the 2000s, that vacancy rate was a little bit higher, and there's been some adjustment to that. We could postulate about why that is. There's been some successful implementation of deed-restricted housing actually built here. That's part of it for sure. And then something that second homeowners have been, part-time residents have been telling us for years since, I first started in 1998 is, hey, we're going to eventually move here for full-time. And I think that there's some degree of that happening. We don't really have data for that, but it shows you that this is holding pretty steady over time. In terms of population, we sort of broke this down. One of the things that we always do when we're doing demographic analysis up here is we look at what RAFTA has been, we look at the RAFTA studies because that's high stakes. When they're doing demographic analysis, you really want to look at the way that organization does their demographic analysis, and we try to use some of the same data, because there's some serious consequences to getting it wrong and opening up a bus route that's not going to work, and so they're pretty carefully done analysis. And also the RAFTA area, that Roaring Fork region, that sort of defines what our region is. It's Up Valley, it's Pickens County, it's the little chunk of Eagle County, around Algebel and Basalt, and then it's most of Garfield County really at that point. So within it, Pickens County actually had pretty decent population growth going from 2004 to 2013, and these are different time frames, right? Those are not equivalent time frames, so look at the numbers. Pretty decent population growth, especially considering that this is pretty much post-recession. Looking at through here, there was probably a little bit of a drop-off in there. So growing at about 1.8% during that time period, that 2004 through 13 time period. And then since 2013, when things kind of bottomed out, it's been sort of sub 1%. So still same thing with the jobs. It was growing faster before, but post-recession, it's kind of picked up. It's growing moderately. The real growth in the region was in Garfield County, during this time period. Garfield County, as you can see, though, has slowed down significantly since 2013. They sort of had the double whammy of the recession and the oil and gas industry, taking a turn that really hurt a lot of the local communities and the economy in Garfield County. So, that regional growth is important because these are our resident customers for the airport, and our employees and our brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles and all of that. So it's very interconnected. We had to actually do the rest of what I'm going to show you to come up with this particular graphic, but I just wanted to throw it out up front in that when in a busy day up here, there's a lot more folks around than just the people that live here. We all know that. But we've actually been able to gather enough data points to estimate roughly what that is for low season and peak season. So average doesn't actually really mean that much here because it's always waxing and waning. There's peak season and off season, and there's somewhere in between. But on average, you have almost 44,000 people up here on an annual basis. Low season, that drops down to about 34,000. Peak season, which is what this graphic, this is actually, so we got the average low in the chart. This graphic shows you the components of peak population, where we actually, and in this we include commuters because every day you have people coming from outside of Pickens County into the county to work. And those are part of the people that are around that you see downtown that are on the roads and et cetera, et cetera. Your overnight accommodations occupants, this includes both traditional lodging, your sort of professionally managed condo, hotel, short-term rentals, and your rental by owner, your vacation rentals. And then this is peak season part-time residents. Part-time residents mirror the same season as other visitors do. So they're actually, their occupancy is actually quite a bit lower overall, but it does mirror the same kind of seasonality that we see with just overnight visitors that are staying in lodging. So yeah, I mean, up to, somewhere around basically over 50,000 people in Pickens County, mostly up valley, during peak season is what we estimate. And these numbers will, where we came up with the visitor numbers, we'll get into that and explain that a little bit later on in the show, beginning right now. So that was sort of the population and jobs in the big picture. We wanted to move into some indicators about what's happening with the visitor market, because as you'll see next in the presentation from Linda, a big chunk, 3/4 or some odd percentage of the commercial passengers at the airport are visitors. So visitation, we know this, right? Visitation and the airport are related on some level, but we're going to explore more about what that is. So skier days, it's actually pretty impressive how well the skier days have recovered. Again, the bottom out, you can kind of see that bottom out in 11 and 12. But skier days have really recovered and have sort of exceeded the numbers that we've seen, in the last 20 years or so. So a lot of success there in terms of building skier days. That's obviously really important economically, and the skiing generates a lot of our wintertime visitation, right? So important indicator, definitely on the rise in the last couple years and kind of beyond recovery. Like it's recovery and then some. One of the better indicators actually for how much is going on up here in Pickens County is the flows at the Aspen Consolidated Sanitation District, because that catches it all, right? So this is I don't know if I should say what the term of this is, but I'll say it. My geography professor, when we were looking back in '98 when I was trying to get my first job up here, anyways, so we call it the population. But the Aspen Consolidated Sanitation District, this is all the wastewater that goes into the pipes. So it's out of the structures. It has nothing to do with irrigation. It's somewhat detached from all the different ways that water gets used, and it really is the stuff that goes into the pipes from inside of a structure. And it's a great indicator for the amount of activity. So this is your sort of averaged monthly flows for 2015, 2017, which are through 3 complete years. We average those. According to the sanitation flows, July is the busiest month. So one of the things that this captures that is really hard to capture any other way is that this includes day visitors. And we know that there are an awful lot of day visitors that are on their way through on a multi-destination trip that just come up, they're staying in Glenwood, whatever, they come up for the day. A lot of that goes on. We don't really have a good handle on how many people that is, but this captures it. I mean, if those folks are in town, they're going to cause some wastewater to go down to the sewer plant. So you can see that July peak. But hey, our winter peaks are, especially in recent years, are pretty close to those summer peaks, which is impressive because that's wintertime. It's just so much harder to get people to come and do that. You have to have awesome ski areas. This is something that a lot of communities that don't have a strong winter economy struggle with, and they would love it if their sanitation flows look this way. So this is what it looks like, trend lined out, and really kind of going month by month so that we can see the big peaks. You know, most of your peaks are in July. But, you know, especially, I mean, one of the things that you see happening here is sort of a decline. You know, both of your highs, and this green dotted line here is your average peak month, which is July. That's your average peak month flows, and then the orange one is your average low season flows, which is pretty consistently November and May. And so just kind of looking against that, you know, we haven't quite gotten up to this level, right, of activity. If we look at this as purely an indicator of activity, there are other factors, you know, water conservation, especially on the commercial side. I mean, we've come a long way in terms of water conservation from the commercial and institutional side. So we should recognize that. But even despite that, you can see that things are kind of declining, sort of bottoms out in this 12, 13, 14 era. And then we're coming back up. And look at this, the January 17 peak almost matched to the summer before. So our January peaks are fairly respectable, and I'd be really curious to see how that works out in the end, because I hear from the old timers that it used to be busier in the winter consistently, and that the busyness in the summer is more of a recent phenomenon. And by recent, I mean, you know, within the last 20 years, I guess, if we're looking at that. But the lows are raising here. Like, that's, I think, another really important factor to point out. And that's something that people that are in tourism really work hard on, is trying to plug those off-season gaps. So that shows some success with that. And it also shows that we're starting to get back up there in terms of the peaks that we experienced pre-2010, but we're still really, using this indicator, not quite there. So now we switch to a very similar looking graph, but this is occupancy. It's hotel, it's occupant. We're going to be talking about two different kinds of lodging units. One is traditional lodges and professionally managed units, which are mainly referred to as condo hotels for the most part, but there are actually some single family homes in that. So that it's not the whole picture. There's these VRBOs, these RBOs that we're going to deal with in a separate way. So that's what this occupancy refers to. And you can see similar, boy, it looks a lot like the sanitation flows did, except the recession hit right away with regard to occupancy. Like, it was almost immediate. I mean, there you've got January, here you've got May 09. So that it did not take long for occupancy to take a pretty hard hit from the recession. I think a lot of the other indicators were slower, but occupancy got blasted pretty quickly. I mean, July 09, we're down to like sub 60% occupancy, which is something that nobody had experienced probably for quite a while before that. But again, increasing slowly but surely, and then, you know, you can see the same kind of pattern with like January coming back up and getting closer to July occupancy, but still July occupancy is at like, it's around 83%, and so it's higher than the winter occupancy. But if we look at this a different way, so this is the bar graph of the averages like I did with the sanitation flows, the winter peak is longer. It's not maybe quite as intense in terms of like really maxing things out. Like 82% for a monthly occupancy, that's getting pretty close to like realistically full. 90% is what Desdometrics and the lodging experts that Stay Aspen Snowmass hire say is the maximum occupancy for peak season. So you're getting close to that in the summer, just close to a full house essentially. But in the winter, a little bit more room to move, but a much longer, more sustained period of occupancy going on, of higher occupancy going on there. So now we're going to talk about inventory, right? So we were talking about like trying to estimate how, what's going on with the number of visitors. Let's talk a little bit about where folks are staying, and kind of break that down a little bit, because that has a lot to do with how many people can be here. So thank you, Stay Aspen Snowmass, for sharing the transient inventory. This is something that this company called Intopia, formerly Destimetrics, I think they might actually still, I don't know how all this works. I think they're still called Destimetrics, but they actually call all the lodges and all the property management companies in the operating up here. Oops, what did I just do? Oh, I just had a spaz attack. Oh, there we go. There we go. Okay, so they actually call all of the property management unit companies and lodging companies and ask them, how many units do you have? How many rooms, pillows, all this information. So it's pretty reliable information. They do it every 3 years, and so we actually have this data back to 2009 now. And before that, we didn't have this. Like, we had occupancy, but we didn't have this kind of inventory data where we actually knew how many units were being occupied. But hey, the take home here is that we're kind of, it fluctuated a little bit here and there, but we're kind of back to where we started in 2009. This is for all intents and purposes, this from an inventory perspective is kind of right after the recession happened. So the recession probably didn't have a lot of impact on this, but hey, guess what? We have not really overall, with Aspen and Snowmass combined, grown in traditional lodging and these professionally managed short-term rentals. Pretty flat, but there's a lot of them. I mean, there's around 4,000 of them. I mean, it's not like we don't have any. It's just the direction is pretty flat. Pillows look the same. So pillows are really important here because, especially with the condo hotels, you can have 3 or 4 bedrooms and a much higher capacity than in a traditional lodging unit like the one I stayed in last night. So, using rough math here, have capacity for about 15,000 guests with your current inventory of pillows. And this is something also that Destimetrics and it actually empirically track this information. So just breaking down a little bit into what and where, what kinds of units and where, these are basically showing you the hotel lodge pillows actually gained. This was counterintuitive to me because there's been a lot of concern about sort of losing lodging, where you just walk in with your luggage. But that's where we gained pillows. We actually lost significant number of pillows in the condominium market, and then gained a few in the private home market. So these are professionally managed side of it. This is your traditional lodging side of it. Traditional lodging gained some ground in terms of the number of pillows. So we don't all the way know why this is. I mean, I think there's probably a way to find that out, but if anybody has any theories, maybe we can talk about it later. Some of it maybe they're listing on those RBO platforms. In terms of where, Aspen gained some pillows, and this is not without trying, right? This is something that both Aspen and Snowmass actually try to do, is gain pillows. But in this same time period through 2018, Snowmass lost some, right? So it only takes a couple of developments to turn these trends one direction or another, but this is kind of comparing 09 to 2018 with the data that we have. This is the direction it's gone lately. In terms of the kinds of units, this is good news for a guy like me who likes to go on little ski trips with his family. There's been an increase in economy and moderate units as an overall proportion, but you're still half deluxe accommodations. So expensive, we know that. But some of this stuff is it's not an accident. These are things that communities and tourism leaders have been actually trying to do. So I hope that it's viewed as good news for some folks. One of the things that these guys at Destimetrics do is they ask the property managers when the thing was built. I think that's how they must get this information. But it just shows you, I mean, we don't, I haven't really vetted how they do this, but the take home, I think, is significant in that most of this stuff was built, over 20 years ago. Most of it was built in the 70s, actually. So some of it's been refurbished and, that sort of thing. So people take care of the properties up here because they're so valuable. But at some point, this part of the inventory is these buildings are going to run out of life. So it's just something to think about long term. And a lot of redevelopment has been, I know more about Aspen than I do Snowmass Village, and there's been quite a bit of redevelopment of lodging in the city of Aspen. And I think we'll see more of that as time goes on, just because of the age of the units. So we had to, the last time we tried to do this kind of work, we didn't have any reliable information on rental by owner, and we were able to get that. As of January this year, actually, this company called AirDNA has this information, and it's worth keeping track of from here on out because it tells us what was before just this room full of smoke in terms of these rentals. And so it's a whole different, we have to talk a little bit of a different language here because the difference is so if you have a hotel, the hotel's there and it's either, if it's open, you walk in and you book it and it's there. A rental by owner, they can be open whenever they feel like it. They can list it, they can unlist it, so it's kind of up to the owner when it's listed and when it's not listed. So there's a bunch of different metrics that we have to look at. The listings are basically if the thing was listed at all during that month, it counts as a listed unit. If it was booked at all, that's a booked listing. And then room nights is another part of it. So the room nights, they total those up. And the listing nights, that's another part of it. So that we have to kind of add that in a month. Listings is one thing. How many nights were units listed, right? So those are listing nights. It's a multiplication thing. Maybe if we get into it, it'll help a little bit. But so back to the data source, they didn't have VRBO involved. That's part of why this stuff is kind of recent. They've been tracking this stuff for a year, but they only had two of the major platforms. They only had Airbnb and Home and Away. So when we still only have this data all the way up through June of 2017, I think is when they started collecting, including the VRBO data. But, even with that said, with these two major platforms, there was a serious ramp up of supply. So these are your available listings. And then the bookings, as these things came on the market and became available, sort of increased at the same rate. So this just shows you, we went from this, where you've got about 250 units on the 300 units on the two major platforms, to this, where we've got over 1,000 units in over a period of just a few years. So the reason that people said we got to figure this RBO thing out is because it was taken off. So then we get into, I got the lesson on the dot and everything. So looking at occupancy for that same time period, it's the seasonality is very similar. Although winter and summer seem to perform about the same, the occupancy is overall lower. And the occupancy it's available nights, it's booked nights over available nights. So it's calculated the same way that the lodging occupancy is calculated. It's just lower in general. But then we get into the better data, starting in June of 2017, where we actually have all three major platforms, and we have a more complete picture of the data. But you can see right in this period, this time period here, the market sort of starts to adjust. So this is your trend line on booked listings. So these are the number of listings that were actually booked, and they're holding pretty steady. I mean, you've got seasonal fluctuations as always, but the supply is actually sort of declining. It's kind of going down. So the market's adjusting a little bit. But we already saw on that last slide that this is an incredibly fluid market, so it can respond to demand. I mean, that's what we're witnessing here. We're witnessing, wow, this new product, this new market, you can list it online, et cetera, bam, it takes off, and now we're kind of seeing it adjust a little bit. But, these are actually significant numbers. It's not the big kid on the block is still the traditional lodging and the professionally managed units, right? These haven't taken over that, but now they're a real player. And again, the occupancy, pretty strong occupancy, and your summer and winter peaks are about the same, but your off-season occupancy for RBOs is higher than your other kind of lodging, than your traditional lodging, your professionally managed units. I don't quite understand why that is. Maybe the prices go down, prices get really good. But the high season occupancy, you just don't reach that 83% that you reach you don't reach. It's 75 in the winter for traditional lodging and professionally managed units, and 83 in the summer is your average occupancy. So your occupancy never quite gets cranked up that high, but still, that's 2/3 occupancy. That's people are obviously using these units. And then we have to kind of do some math. So we have to figure out, okay, how do we compare this kind of available supply and demand to what we have for traditional lodging? And the way we do that essentially is to calculate average daily room nights per month. Right? That's kind of how we have to do it. The occupancy data that we have is monthly. So we did some math to sort of, and it flattens out some of the peaks. But you can see that available room nights. So, basically, if we're thinking about this, that the way that other lodging analysts look at RBOs is a room night is the same thing as a pillow, essentially. So you never really, what they're saying is basically most people don't totally fill up every single bed and every single pillow in a vacation rental. So this is, we're making some assumptions here, but a room night if we think about that as a room night equals pillows, you're reaching supply levels of almost 4,300 available pillows on average during the month. At a given time, 3,600. And the supply is, it's lower. The booked room nights are significantly lower than the supply. So there's some room to absorb available supply right now in that market. So just kind of taking this stuff in for a landing, I guess, we've got, the first thing we want to think about is how many people, so sort of deriving part of that first graph that I showed you. How many people are here in that sort of overnight visitor capacity, and where are they staying? What we came up with is that during peak summer, just under 15,000 are staying in those professionally managed units and traditional lodging, but the capacity for RBOs is around 2,200, so that's a significant chunk of it. Still, your big kid on the block, right? It's not like RBOs have overrun it. It's just that now they're a significant part of the picture. Peak winter is just a little bit lower than peak summer in terms of in just looking at 2018. So we looked at occupancy and we looked at available units to calculate, okay, how many people were actually here during peak summer and peak winter. Peak summer, about 17,000 people here in 2017. Peak winter, about 16,300. So very, very close. Low season, you have about 6,000 visitors. That isn't bad. 6,000 visitors in November and May. That's how many visitors we have here right now. 6,000. That's what this estimate tells us. That's pretty good, considering how hard it is to get people to do anything in November and May. Capacity-wise, so I was showing you what we think are actually here. This is what the capacity of all that lodging actually is. The capacity changes a little bit because there's different factors that you would apply. So you would apply during off season, you're lower staffed, and so your capacity is going to be a little bit lower. Peak season, we're assuming you can go for it and that your capacity is 90% of your pillows. So that's kind of what your capacity looks like. But one of the take-homes here is that there's potentially some remaining capacity in our existing stock. And I think it'd be interesting to run this by some people that are actually in the business to see whether, hey, do you agree that we have a little bit more capacity in July? I think that'd be something worth testing. But running the numbers, we say, okay, yeah, we potentially have capacity for over 3,000 more guests on an average day, whatever it is, in the Up Valley area, and quite a bit more than that even in the wintertime because of the way the dynamics between how much is available and how much is listing and how much occupancy that we're seeing. So obviously huge amounts of capacity in the off season, which is why the tourism professionals work so hard to try to get things going on here in the off season. So just kind of back up real quick here. We've seen, it's been growing here the whole time. From a population sort of traditional growth metrics, yeah, it's been chipping away, growing a little bit slower after the recession, but things picked up again after the recession. We definitely had a downtime there, but things have been picking up. Your visitor indicators, skier days have been on the rise. It looks like the sanitation flows also indicate that visitation is on the rise, but it's not a drastic increase. It's sort of a slow but steady increase. And it looks like our traditional lodging and hotel condos have been basically flat in terms of supply since 2009 at least. The RBO market was really dynamic at first, but from what we can tell, it's sort of adjusted and leveled off. But one way or another, if you add all this up, low season you got about 34,000 people up here, and high season, peak season, you got over 50,000 people, 53,000 people. But maybe some additional capacity within the existing stock.
All right. All right, so a lot of statistics here. We are going to take a 15-minute break, and when we come back, Linda Perry is going to marry some of the statistics that you heard from Gabe up here about growth in the valley and marry it with the forecasting approach that we do at Aspen-Picken County Airport. She's going to give you the context of forecasting and the region that is the service area for Aspen-Picken County Airport, and we're going to try to match these two concepts together. So 15 minutes, be back by 5:20, and we'll see you for Linda Perry's discussion. We are going to bring everything back together, but before we do, I think there was some really great questions at the break, and we want to make a couple of points of clarification really quick. So Gabe, do you want to come up?
Sure.
Okay.
Are we going to, can I mess around?
No, it's a different PowerPoint.
Okay. All right. So I think the thing, and actually now that I think about it, somebody asked me about this. Remember the 53,000 peak population that I talked about? That was for Picken County. So it's 53,000 peak population in Picken County. And that first graph that I showed, the components of peak population with the 17 grand visitors and all that, that's in Picken County. It wasn't the only time we talked about the regional population is when we had that graph up there with Garfield County and Eagle County on it. So that 53,000 people, that's here. 30-some thousand in the off season, 50,000 during peak season. That's here in Picken County. Most of it up valley, obviously, because that's where most of the stuff is. So.
And our next speaker is Linda Perry from Lee Fisher. She is our subject matter expert on all things forecasting and air service. Come on up.
Good evening, everyone. If I can get Tonight we're going to talk about the aviation forecasting process and the key drivers of aviation activity at Aspen-Pitkin Airport. This graphic basically shows a flow chart of the key steps that we go through in preparing a forecast. And this adheres to the guidance that the FAA provides in terms of how forecasts should be prepared and what they're looking for when they review and approve a forecast. So obviously the first thing that we're doing is collecting data, and Gabe provided plenty of that during his presentation, and we'll take that and run with it. We also, as part of this, use a number of different analytical tools to prepare the forecast, trend analysis, econometric analysis, and so forth, whatever is appropriate for the airport that we're forecasting. One of the key things that people sometimes forget is what the airport role is. That can have a big factor in what the forecast methodology is and what the forecast will be going forward. And we'll talk about that, what that means for Aspen in just a minute. And then once we collect all this data, we need to decide or define what the key drivers of passenger traffic are. Because what those key drivers are and what we expect those key drivers to be in the future are what feed into the passenger forecast. For example, if we think that the number of hotel rooms, the lodging supply, is a key factor in driving Aspen-Pitkin Airport passengers, then we need to know what we think the future supply of lodging is going to be down the road, because that will affect the passenger traffic at the airport. Once we define these key drivers, we prepare annual forecasts of what we call aviation demand, which consists of the passengers and cargo, if appropriate. And that's kind of our basis. That's the basis starting point. How many passengers do we think there are going to be in the future? Once we have that, we translate that into the number of operations needed to accommodate those passengers. And in order to do that, we need to understand what the load factors are. Load factors is a technical term, but basically it's like an occupancy rate. What percentage of the aircraft on average are filled with people? We also need to know how large the aircraft are, how many seats per operation, and that's a function of airline fleets and what airlines expect to operate in the future. So that all goes into the translation of passengers into operations. And once we're done with all that, we have to go to the FAA for approval for the ASE Vision plan. They'll review the forecast, look at the appropriate methodology, and provide an approval of the forecast going forward. And we'll talk about that more in a little bit. The derivative forecasts are basically peak period forecasts. The planning folks need the peak planning, peak forecast, peak hour, average day, peak month in order to plan facilities. So this graphic is the same graphic, but right now we're in the process of collecting the data as Gabe described, and I put up here some of the key factors that he pointed out about the peak population, the Roaring Fork Valley population of 84,000, peak overnight visitors. Those are all things that we connect to the passengers at the airport and what that means going forward. We look at the historical growth trends. You'll see some econometric analysis of how we relate the underlying factors in Pitkin County and the surrounding area, things like population, employment, income, the cost of travel, how much a ticket is, and so forth, and how that affects the number of passengers you have at the airport. And then finally, we talk about the airport role for Aspen. And Aspen is a spoke in airline networks. It's a destination airport for visitors, and it's an origin airport for residents. And it's a spoke in airline networks because all of the flights, as you'll see later on, feed into an airline hub such as Denver, Chicago, Houston, and so forth. You don't have any point-to-point service from Aspen to, say, Orlando for people who want to go to Disney World. So it's the role of the airport is very important in understanding the forecast. If we were forecasting for a connecting hub airport like Denver, we'd have to understand the airline plans for connecting traffic, what aircraft they're going to use for that, and so forth. So it's a lot more complex for a connecting airport like Denver. So it's important to know the roles. And then we'll get to, in the presentation, what we think the key factors are and what we think they'll be in the future and what the implications are for passenger traffic in the future. So the first thing that Gabe talked about is the airport service region. The Roaring Fork Valley has 84,000 people. The overall airport service region here is defined as the 3 counties of Eagle, Garfield, and Pitkin. And those 3 counties together today have a population of 134,000. So that's kind of the overall population base. Going forward, according to the Colorado Department of Local Affairs, the growth rate for these 3 counties together is about 1.6% per year over the next 20 years. So keep that fact in your mind. That's kind of the growth that's projected going forward. We can also look at a metric that looks at the number of passenger trips per person in the airport service region, just by dividing the number of passengers by the population. And there's actually a fairly high number, 3.4 trips per person on average for the airport. Of that, average of about 1 per year is taken by residents, and the remaining 2.4 trips per year is by visitors. So again, getting back to the key drivers, we first have to understand what the key components of traffic are at the airport. And we know that here the key components are residents and visitors. And this is based on USDOT, a survey of passenger traffic. They sample all tickets in the United States, take a 10% sample. And this is the basis for this distribution. And this is a little bit different from what Gabe talked about in terms of visitors to Pitkin County and how the methodology behind that. This is actually based on USDOT data for actual tickets sold. And some of the key factors that we're going to talk about are listed up there, and what are the ones that are important for Aspen County. And you can see in the graph below that the growth in resident travel, sure. Just the commercial. Not in these data, no. No. Sure, no problem. It's very technical. Just for clarification, the FAA, the USDOT do not collect the data on the number of passengers who board general aviation aircraft. There's no. Yes. Yes, that's absolutely correct. Right, and we'll get to that. But just for point of clarification, data on GA passengers are not collected, so we'll never have a true understanding of the number of passengers. Actually, at international. In this particular airport, that's a huge. Yes. About half of the operations at the airport are by GA aircraft. That's what we're going to talk about later. That helps me understand. Okay, no problem. And the reason this is important is that there are different drivers for residents versus visitor travel. And as you can see in the bottom graph, the growth in resident travel has been fairly constant at about 3.5%, while the growth in visitor travel has varied, with stronger growth in the 2010 to 2018 period, bumping up to about 3%. But overall, the average growth in passengers at the airport has varied between 1% to 2% per year, depending on what time period you're looking at. So we're going to talk about the key drivers of, and this is commercial airline traffic that we're talking about here, what the key drivers are. That's the key, one of the key demand drivers that we need to define for the FAA. And the FAA's forecast guidance dictates that we identify what the causal factors are for the growth. So we have to understand what's driving the growth at the airport. Is it the number of skiers that come here? Is it the underlying economics? Is it the cost of a ticket? What is it that drives the growth? And the graph on the right shows some historical growth rates for Pitkin County Airport compared with some other resort destination airports. And as you can see from the graph, the average growth rate over the last 28 years for Aspen has been 0.9%, under 1% a year. This is in terms of passenger traffic. And comparing that to the other resort destination airports has been a bit faster historically. So this looks complicated, but it really isn't. What we're doing here is comparing the change in some underlying economic factors with the change in passengers at the airport. So the blue line represents the historical trend in passenger traffic at Aspen-Pitkin Airport, and the other lines present models that relate passengers to certain variables. So for example, predicted population. If you compare the growth in population with the growth in passengers at Aspen Airport, the population changes explain about 64% of the historical variation in passengers, which is surprising because typically for an airport, a commercial airport, the passengers' growth is related to two things primarily. One is how much people have to spend, their per capita income, and two, how much it costs to travel, the price of a ticket. That's typically the strongest growth factors for passenger traffic. But here we're seeing that the population here is really the strongest of all the underlying economic variables that relate to passenger traffic. Total personal income explains about 52%, so it's up there. But employment, per capita personal income, and Aspen skier days, which we looked at, aren't as strong an explanatory power as population. And that's important to think about going forward, because if we understand what the growth in population is going to be in the future, and that's a driver of passenger traffic at the airport, then you have a pretty good handle on what the passenger traffic is going to look like. Now, the US DOT has data on average fare for the airport in particular. These are data for Aspen Airport, and also has data on a thing called yield, airline yield. Yield sounds like it's something that you get a return on, but actually what it is the average fare paid to fly one passenger 1 mile. So it takes the distance out of it. You think about comparing fares, and the fares differ depending on how far you're traveling, right? I mean, if you're going to London, the fare is maybe $2,000. If you're going to Denver, the fare is $300 or $400. So the yield actually breaks down the fare and removes the distance because it's looking at a smaller metric. It's looking at how much it costs, how much people pay to travel 1 mile. And in this case, the airfares, the yield, the fuel, we looked at all of it, explains very little of the trends in traffic at the airport. You can see that the lines are above the historical trend, so they're over-predicting what actually happened, and in some cases below the trend. So they're under-predicting what the traffic would be. And because snowfall is such a big factor here for the residents and also for the skiers, we also took a look at what the relationship between the passengers at the airport and snowfall, thinking that snowfall for residents might mean that they travel less, and more snowfall for visitors might mean that they travel more. But what we found is there's really no correlation. It really doesn't explain much of the trends in historical passenger traffic. When we combine it with other things, like population and personal income, then it increases the amount of variation that it explains. So at the end of the day, when we ran through all these permutations of different combination of variables and what explained most of the trends in passenger traffic at Aspen, we came up with a model with population and airline yield, or the cost to transport one passenger 1 mile, a cost of travel variable. Those are the two key things that seem to explain most of the historical trends in passenger traffic. So if we understand what those variables will be in the future, we can use those independent forecasts to help us forecast what passenger traffic at the airport will be. And that's one of the requirements of the FAA forecast guidance, is that you have a solid statistical basis for which you base your passenger forecasts on. You know, you don't just pick a number out of the air. There has to be explanation of the causal factors that drive passenger demand at the airport. So moving on to airport role, I mentioned earlier that the role of Aspen is a spoke in the airline hub networks. So all the traffic, all the service, nonstop service from Aspen goes into a major connecting hub of a major airline. And obviously United accounts for about almost 70% of the traffic here. The graph on the right shows that the nonstop flights from Aspen has increased over the last 8 years. In 2010, most of the service was to Denver, and since then, more service has been offered to various other airline connecting hubs. And you can really understand what it means to be an airline connecting hub by looking at their route maps. You can see Aspen in the blue, and then all the other yellow markers are United Airlines hubs. And Aspen has service to 5 of United's 7 hubs. The only ones not served directly from Aspen are DC and Newark. And the graph on the right shows what your average daily departures are here by airline. How many average flights in the peak month does United provide? How many does Delta and American? Here are the same type of hub route networks for American and Delta. And you can see that, again, the concentration of flights at each of these cities demonstrates that city is a connecting hub for that airline. All of the routes kind of spread out from those regions, and Aspen is one of the spokes in that route. Now, the key thing about all of these is that Aspen is served by 3 major airlines, American, Delta, United. But SkyWest Airlines is the regional carrier for all of those airlines. So essentially, the service provided to Aspen is by one airline. It's by SkyWest Airlines. And so it's important to understand what regional airlines, how they operate, how they contract with the major carriers like American, Delta, and United, and what it means for service in the future for Aspen. And one of the things that has been a challenge of late is the number of regional airline pilots. Over the last, since 2010, 2000, more than 130 airports have lost service, in part due to the regional pilot shortage, but also in part because of changes in the mix of aircraft, which we'll get to in just a minute. But the pilot shortage has come up because it used to be that a lot of pilots were trained in the military. And then they come to commercial service. But for regional airlines in particular, the pay until of late was very low, maybe $50,000 a year for a pilot. But they weren't getting any pilots. They weren't getting enough pilots to fly the aircraft. So you'll see ads, if you go to their websites, you'll see ads like this: signing bonuses, increase in incentive bonuses, and things like that. Because without the military training our pilots, they have to pay for the expense themselves, which is quite expensive for a pilot, $100,000 or more to get the training and the number of hours that you need to fly. And to complicate all of that and compound the challenge, there have been legislative changes to the rules, which has affected the supply of pilots. In 2009, the hours flown for new pilots increased to 1,500 hours from 250. Well, that's quite a bump, and that left a lot of pilots with not enough hours to fly. In 2010, the duty time rule decreased to mitigate pilot fatigue. It actually came about, I think, as a result of a crash of a regional airline, and that also reduced the supply of pilots. The only thing that's offset that in recent years is they increased the mandatory retirement age from 60 to 65, which has helped offset the decreasing supply of pilots. And you can see in the graph below that since 2010, we've lost 24,000 commercial pilots in the U.S. That's a lot of pilots to lose. So the next section just looks at the historical traffic at the airport, and this one in particular relates the historical traffic with the trends in average domestic fare. And the reason this is important is because you can see, particularly in the later years, in the last few years, the average airfare has continued to increase. And yet, at the same time, the number of passengers has had some dips and valleys, but it too has continued to increase. And the reason this is important is because it suggests that the passenger traffic at Aspen is somewhat insensitive to fares, that they'll pay the fare to take the trip. There may come a point where that's no longer the case, but at least in recent years, we see that in the data. This slide shows the busiest 10 markets for Aspen. Most of these happen to coincide with some of the hubs that airlines operate that provide nonstop service to Aspen, but for each of the 10 busiest destinations, the only one that's experienced a loss in passengers since 2010 is Denver. And at the same time, the average fare to each of these top 10 busiest markets has increased. And the significance of this, and looking at this historically and going forward, is that fares typically are inversely related to passenger traffic. That is, as the fare goes up, the passenger traffic goes down, and vice versa. So the question is, how much longer will these fare increases go, and at what point will they have a negative impact on passenger traffic growth at the airport? Seasonality, Gabe talked about that earlier. Definitely seasonal trends at the airport. The first 3 months of the year account for roughly 15% of annual passenger traffic. That's a high percentage for an airport. Typically, the peak month for most airports is about 9%. But because you have a strong visitor season, winter season here, that's why these numbers are so high. And the real, important point is that those 4 months, December, January, February, March, account for about more than half of the annual number of passengers. At the same time, we talked about the seasonality of visitors and occupancy rates that Gabe talked about earlier. The peak in the summer months for airport passengers is nowhere near as peaked as what the occupancy rates are or as what the daily room nights are. So whatever the summer traffic is being driven by, people aren't coming through the airport for that travel. At least these data suggest. But the passenger traffic during the peak season is important to understand because that's the driver of planning facilities at the airport. We have to understand what the peak number of passengers will be during that period to make sure that they're accommodated. As I mentioned earlier, one of the assumptions we have to make to translate passengers into the number of operations for the future is how large the aircraft will be, what the average seats per operation will be. And that's a function of what aircraft airlines have in their fleets and what they expect to have in the future. At Aspen right now, all of the aircraft are what's called Group 2. And the airplane design group designations basically reflect the tail height and the wingspan. So in the earlier years, up to about 2012 or so in here, the gray bars, those were the Q400s that were operated by United, which had a a wingspan of 85 feet. So that put them in this category, Group 3. But today, most of the flights, or all of the flights rather, are operated by the CRJ 700, which is a Group 2, because its wingspan is in the Group 2 category. I think it's 76 feet. So again, today, Aspen has all Group 2 aircraft. The thing is that the Q400 and the CRJ 700 carry the same number of seats. It's the same number of passengers, the capacity for to carry passengers at the airport. So if we compare the distribution of aircraft at Aspen with these other resort destination airports, you'll see that Aspen is the only one with all Group 2 aircraft. Airports like Steamboat Springs have a mix of Group 2 and Group 3. Some airports like Eagle has not only Group 2 and Group 3, but they also have Group 4, which means that they have some 737s flying into the airport, most likely during the peak season when there's a lot of traffic. But this just gives you a sense of how the aircraft fleet mix at Aspen compares to other resort destination airports. I mentioned earlier that the service at Aspen, although linked to the major carriers, is provided basically all by SkyWest, which is a regional airline that contracts with the 3 major airlines. And this table basically summarizes the aircraft that they have in their fleet, how many, what their seat configuration is. You can see that the largest aircraft is 76 seats. And that has to do with a lot of the pilot scope agreements in their contracts outsourcing to regional airlines. They can't operate aircraft with more than 76 seats. That's a part of the pilot contracts. We also see here the average age. You can see that the CRJ 200s, which a lot of airlines have gotten rid of over the last few years, are an average of 16, right now 16 years for SkyWest fleet. Typically, a narrow-body, wide-body aircraft has a maximum useful life of 25 to 30 years. If the airline really likes it, it's like your car that keeps running and you don't want to get rid of it because you'd have to buy a new one, they keep them beyond that. The DC-9, I think, went to 34 years useful life on average because it was such a good aircraft. For the regional aircraft, the smaller aircraft like this, the useful life is typically lower. 15 to 20 years. It depends on the airline, depends on the aircraft. The CRJ 200 in particular was not fuel inefficient. There were more fuel efficient aircraft coming online, so airline replaced them with those. It was a high maintenance, high cost to operate. So I think the range of maximum useful life, this is about it, 16 to 20 years for the regional aircraft. You can also see that SkyWest, in combination with the major airlines, has orders for 12 E-175s. Now, an E-175 is a Group 3 aircraft, so it still carries 76 seats, but it has a larger wingspan. They also have orders for 15 CRJ 900s, also with 76 seats. More modern aircraft being produced. So this gives you a sense of the average size of aircraft that are operated by these regional carriers and why. And part of it has to do with pilot contracts, the scope in their contracts. General aviation. As I mentioned earlier, general aviation accounts for about half of the operations at the airport. The pie chart on the left, whoops, I didn't touch anything. Oh, there we go. It's basically the number of based aircraft that's provided by the FAA count. And you can see that the aircraft based at the airport, about 71% of them are single engine. They do primarily, I would guess, touch and goes, local flying around the airport. But as you all know, there are a lot of high-performance business jets at the airport. So the graph on the right, the bar chart, shows what those aircraft are. So in 2018, of the general aviation operations performed at the airport, about 21% of those operations were local operations performed by aircraft based or around within the visual site of the airport, but the rest were what we call itinerant, meaning they came from other places outside of the region. And the types of aircraft operated, some of them are Group 3. Some of these business jets are Group 3 because of their wingspans. But they're all high-performance, state-of-the-art type aircraft. And we get this data from the FAA, from the flight plans that the airlines file with the FAA for their itinerant operations. As I mentioned in the last slide, general aviation operations account for almost half of total operations at the airport. And you can see that the trend in general aviation operations has been decreasing. That's consistent with what we see at other airports throughout the United States and the trend nationally. The cost to fly, the aircraft stock is older, the insurance costs and liability costs have all contributed to the decline in the number of general aviation operations performed. So in that sense, Aspen is a bit of an exception in terms of the number of high-performance business jets that operate here on a daily basis. And we have no way, as this gentleman asked, of knowing how many passengers those general aviation aircraft carry. So this last part is an important part because it gives you a sense of what the forecast might look like. The FAA prepares a forecast for each airport in the United States. It's called the Terminal Area Forecast, or TAF, T-A-F. And the reason they do that is they use it as a basis for projecting employment, a basis for projecting the number of air traffic controllers that they'll need, and so forth. But about 20 years ago, the FAA decided, when there was a lot of growth in the United States, that they were going to use the TAF as a way to keep airport operators in check in terms of the development, the facilities they constructed at their airports. So as a requirement of the forecast to be reviewed by the FAA, we have to pass certain guidelines. And I'm going to switch to the next slide and come back to this. The guidelines are that in the first 5 years, the planning forecasts that we come up with have to be within 10% of the TAF. And in the first 10 years, our forecasts have to be within 15% of the TAF. So what you see here is the blue line is the TAF for Aspen. This is what the FAA has said this year, that Aspen will have 318,000 in plane passengers roughly by 2038 in the next 10 years. So that's the blue line. The green line is the allowed variance above the TAF. And the red line is the allowed variance below the TAF. And the reason that's important is that if we were to come up with forecasts outside of this range, we would have to have a very good reason for it. We would have to have a letter from an airline saying that they were going to add service, some structural change to the traffic at the airport. So going forward, the range of growth that we're talking about here in relation to the TAF is on the high side. The growth for the blue line is 0.8% per year, and the number of passengers, that strangely enough is like population growth. So again, it goes back to the relationship that we developed earlier between passenger traffic at Aspen and population. On the high side, it could be 1.3%, and on the low side, basically no growth at all, 0.2%. So whatever forecast we come up with have to be within this range. There's no spike line that's going to go, up here. It has to be within this range. Because the guidelines require that we base our forecast on current conditions. And the current conditions are, we're starting at 272,000 1,000 passengers, and we have a certain level of service. So basically, we project that forward. The same is true, this is just compares, we said that the baseline TAF was a growth rate for Aspen of 0.8% per year. But if we compare that to the other resort destination airports, you can see that the growth rates vary, with Eagle having a somewhat slower growth rate for the next 20 years, and some of the other airports having faster growth rates. So it all depends on the character of the airport, the current conditions, what the airlines are flying, that drives these growth rates. We also have to do the same test for commercial aircraft operations. That's excluding GA. That's the air carrier and air taxi operations that the FAA counts. We have to also be within the TAF by that same percentage range. So for commercial aircraft operations, we're talking about the current TAF is about 26,000 in 20 years. That's rounding up. From a basis of about, I didn't put the number here, but it's about 22,000 in 2018. On the high side, we could be as high as 98. On the low side, 23. Now, all of this has to be related to the passenger traffic, what assumptions we make about load factor, how full the aircraft are, how large the aircraft are in terms of seats. The math has to work. But at the end of the day, we have to be within this range, or we have to have a very good reason for it. We also have to do the same thing for total operations. So this includes GA. So 49,300 in 20 years in the TAF, the current TAF, and the allowed variance would be 54 on the high side, 44 on the low side. And that's kind of the path forward. The forecasts that we submit to the FAA have to be based on a strong analytical base, defining the causal factors that have driven growth and are expected to grow growth in the future. So there's no pie in the sky, type of forecast. They have to be based on the data. And this is just the TAF for GA operations from the split out here. So what are the key takeaways from all this data and all these graphs that you have before you? Well, we know that the overall service region for the airport in 2017 accounted for about 134,000 people. And population may seem like kind of a boring statistic, but it's actually very important in forecasting demand because your population base drives the number of trips at the airport. That's why you see airline hubs being developed at cities where there's a large enough population base to support, this O&D traffic, starting and ending their trips, because they have to have that support in order to support the connecting through the airport. So the population base is important. We know that Aspen is a spoke in the airline networks. It's a destination airport for visitors and an origin airport for residents, so they're driven by different things. We know that the residents account for about 28% of the total passenger traffic, with the visitors accounting for the remaining 72%. We know that December through March together account for more than half of the passengers at the airport, which is significant, that you don't see that at many airports. We also know that we have a challenge in terms of the number of regional airline pilots. And since Aspen is a community that is served by regional airline exclusively, that has to be a factor considered going forward. General aviation is an important part of the traffic growth at the airport. High-end aircraft supporting the population here and people with second homes. And lastly, that we have this guideline from the FAA in terms of what we can forecast passenger traffic. And that's an average of about 1% per year for the next 20 years. And that's all I have.
Thanks, Linda. Thank you, Linda. Now I'm going to ask our panelists to come up. So John Peacock, John Kinney, Linda's going to stay here, and Gabe, and we're going to quickly shuffle the stage.
Okay, so Q&A is going to be open. We're going to pick one side, then the other. We're going to go back and forth, side to side. Rich is over there with the orange mic. GR is with the blue mic. And I'm just going to alternate sides so that they can move to the next person that has a question so we can keep this going as fast as possible. So I'm just pretty much going to pick the first one, and I'm going to go with Rich's side.
Yeah, so the current terminal was built in 74. Don't believe it's been added. Would it be, I think it would be interesting, at least for me, and I sort of view part of my role as selling what we do here to the public. The size of the terminal and the number of enplanements back that long ago versus now, instead of just going to 2,000, I think that would be interesting information for us to have. Regarding this population element here, it says Pitkin, Eagle, and Garfield County, 132,000, but in an earlier slide you showed the Roaring Fork Valley at 89,000 or something like that. And I was sort of wondering how the competitive circle of when they go to Eagle versus when they go to Aspen is impacted, how that works and how you take that into consideration. And again, if you would provide if you have the data that would go back to the existing terminal that when it was built, that'd be awesome.
Well, the USDOT has data back to 1975. I'm not sure they have it 1974. Maybe the airport might have records. They'd be on paper. So we might get close to that. But yeah, we'll look that up. The second part of your question is the 134,000, the 3 counties, is basically we have to have a basis for the data. And we're somewhat limited by the data that we have. We don't have a historical series of what Gabe defined as the Roaring Fork Valley, the 84,000. What Gabe presented was one point in time. So we need a historical series in order to, consistent series in order to relate it to the data for the airport. But you made a good point, because the size of the airport service region is really determined by not only the service at Aspen, but also the service at the surrounding airports and the fares. So, think of the airport service region as kind of an amoeba that kind of changes depending on the conditions of service, fares, and not only at the airport, but at the airports around Aspen Airport. Does that answer your question? Sort of? Well, we don't have a historical series of population, do we, back to for Roaring Fork Valley?
I mean, one of the we're getting into some weeds here a little bit, but one of the problems is that the Census Bureau changes their block groups over time, and that's always kind of a pain, because they'll change. You'll be so. I think it's kind of doable to take that. So we went back to 2004 with the trend line in the Roaring Fork Valley. I think that's probably doable. We could actually go into RAFTA's libraries and maybe find some older RAFTA reports that use, basically from Aspen to Parachute, which is more or less the Roaring Fork Valley region as we look at it. But I think one of the issues is we have the information on the 24 versus the percentage of passengers that we think are flying locally, but we don't know exactly where those passengers live. We know that they went from here to somewhere else and then back again, but we don't know, that piece of information is something that we don't actually have. When there's somebody in that 28% that we're saying are locals flew out of here, we don't know exactly where they're from in this region. I don't know how you would get that other than intercepting people at the airport and asking them where they're from.
Yeah, I mean, typically that type of data is from a passenger survey conducted at the airport, and you have to do it consecutively. You have to keep it up in order to have a consistent data series. And the thing about going back to getting Roaring Fork and kind of pulling it from different data sources is that you're probably not going to have a consistent data series, and after you go through all that effort and you try to relate it to the passenger traffic growth, you're not going to get a very strong relationship. That's why typically we and the other thing related to that is we want forecasts. We want independent forecasts of whatever drivers we've defined as being important, such as population. We want independent forecasts of those drivers because that feeds into what the passenger traffic is going forward. So if, as DOLA forecasts, the population of the 3 counties is going to be about average 1.6% per year over the next 20 years, that's an important independent source for the forecasts. We're not cooking the books here. We're basing it on somebody else's projection, knowledgeable projections of the region and what the growth will be.
Blue microphone.
Hi, I'm Barry Vaughn. Digging a little bit more into this population issue, the Roaring Fork Valley, as I understand it, stops at Glenwood Springs, and we've only got 17,000 people in Pitkin and maybe about 8,500 in the Roaring Fork part of Eagle. And I don't think there are another 50,000 people living between Carbondale and Glenwood, at least not yet. So how far down does the quote-unquote Roaring Fork go in as you've defined it?
When we think about the Roaring Fork Valley and what the region is, I always, and this, I think a region is not a set thing. It's sort of based on the analysis that you're trying to do, but we always look at the way that RAFTA identifies the region because that's the day-to-day, because RAFTA serves, that's day-to-day transportation, and so it's kind of an objective measure of, hey, this is actually economically related on a day-to-day basis, and basically it's from Aspen to Parachute, which includes most of most of the populated part of Garfield County, which is why when RAFTA looks at Garfield County, they just include all the population because most of it is included from basically Carbondale taking a left down the river to include Parachute.
So it's not the Roaring Fork
True.
geographic watershed, it's the RAFTA service area.
I think they call it the Roaring Fork region. I think that's what they a lot of times, but it's the RAFTA service area. That's how I came up with it.
And then, so does that mean that, and I guess this ties into the $130,000 person figure for the 3 counties, Garfield, Eagle, and Pitkin, that packed in that is the assumption that Aspen Airport serves people who live in the Eagle River main valley, and that people will come here from places like Wolcott or Edwards or Avon or Eagle or Gypsum to fly out of the Aspen spoke to the Denver hub or elsewhere, and the same assumption applies to people who live down in Rifle and Parachute and Glenwood Springs, that they're not going to go to Junction or Denver or Eagle, they're going to come up here?
I mean, I'm collecting the feedback that maybe including all of Eagle County isn't matching with people's intuition in terms of those.
Well, if there's some empirical support for that concept that people actually come over here from there, I don't know about that, and maybe it happens, but it's not intuitive to me that people who could fly out of Eagle or take the shuttle to Denver are going to come over here to initiate their air travel, or vice versa. I did fly once from LA to Eagle to come up here, but I think that was anomalous.
I mean, I think that's important input for us to understand.
Okay, thank you.
Rich didn't catch up. Yeah, if you could let us know your name and which group you're into, there, just so we can
Yes,
keep
Jay
track of it.
Hughes, and I'm on the Vision Committee.
Thank you.
the Experience Committee. I'm wondering if we have numbers from SkyWest or United of how many people get dropped in Denver each year for weather-related reasons against the numbers that were shown in emplanements. Because we already know, everyone in the room, because we've had that statistic before, that we're the third worst success rate between Denver and here or vice versa of any route in the entire United States. Third worst. So I think it's a very important number for us to understand in the experience side of it. How many people get dumped in Denver? Part of the reason for that, again, from the Experience Committee point of view, is that there's no transportation from Denver to here. So if you get dumped in Grand Junction, there's a bus now, but there's no transportation. So I'm trying to understand for what happens to our visitors, since they're the majority of people coming, and those of us who live here just live with the reality of the weather. How many are actually left in Denver, essentially with no means of transportation?
So when you say left in Denver, you mean people that
They-
wanted to come to Aspen but couldn't make it
Well,
because of the
A
weather?
whole bunch of things. First, they get on the plane, they fly halfway up here, they get turned around, they go back, and then they're dumped. Or they get on a line, they wait 8 or 9 hours, the plane doesn't go, they get dumped. And
Yeah.
So I'm just trying to understand from SkyWest perspective, how many thousands of people every year that are in the emplanements, but in fact never get here, or don't get from here someplace else, to Denver, or someplace else that they're trying to go on
Do you
to
want to
SkyWest.
answer that?
Good question, Jay. We certainly can request that from the three carriers. How many were diverted, how many were canceled, and even maybe what times. So the later you get into the night, as you know, the ground transportation options become almost nil.
They're not, yeah,
So
that's,
we can request that information and have that for you by next time.
John, that huge help, at least to our committee, because I think it has a huge amount to do with the experience of people using the air system, not just our airport. Thank you.
Blue microphone in the back.
Hi, I'm Wayne Etheridge with the Community Character Group. I'm trying to understand the origins of the airport service area. Was that something that was local, or is that handed down from FAA?
Well, okay. Well, it started with Gabe. But typically, the airport service region for an airport is connected to what's defined as the metropolitan statistical area for that region. But there is no metropolitan statistical area for this region. It's primarily Pitkin County and whatever parts of the surrounding counties that might use the airport. So there's no FAA definition for Aspen of what the region is. It's what we define it to be and what we can document, prove that it is.
Well, that seems to be a pretty important planning principle, and if you're using rafted data and using all of Eagle County, I'll use the word used earlier, intuitively that makes no sense to me in terms of planning for our airport. People are traveling on RAFTA, for instance, are traveling for different reasons. And if you're including all of the population of Eagle County, this has already been stated, and all of Garfield, they have other options that are better from a weather standpoint than Pitkin County. And so it concerns me that we've defined a service area that I don't believe is realistic.
Did you want to?
Yeah, this is the first preliminary start of this, so certainly your feedback on what this service area should be is important. If we limited the service to Pitkin County, would we be understating what the service area is? Yes? So the problem is data and how it's presented. And you know, there's only so much money to prepare data, and typically it's prepared on a county level basis, and the DOLA forecasts are on a county level basis. So we are limited to some extent by that. If you think the area is smaller than the 3 counties, we can certainly define it as that, but we might need to apply the growth rates for the 3 counties or some factor and justify it for the population growth of the service region we define. This is still an open question, so your input is important.
This may be building on Wayne's question. I'm not going to try and answer it because I'm not the expert up here, but my understanding of how you're using the data is the employment number is the starting point. That's a real number. That's our airport for sure. And so how you're using the service area isn't so much based on the population, but it's to determine the growth rates that would establish those upper and lower limits for the, I forget what your acronym was now, TAF, for the TAF. And so that may be the conversation that needs to happen a little bit more, is whether that right area has been defined in terms of what that growth factor or decline factor or whatever it wants to be is. So it's not so much that we're drawing it's not the population number that's defining the employment.
No, it's the growth. It's what we expect the growth to be.
Over on this side, orange.
Hi. Maybe I shouldn't be taking the microphone. I'm David Johnson with RAFTA. I'll either help or hurt here. First of all, Gabe, thanks very much for saying we have such great data. Maybe I'll get invited to parties a little more often now. I think you give us too much credit, but I accept all compliments. Regarding the population of the service area and how it applies to the airport planning, I like the analogy to it being an amoeba. I think that 84,000 seems to be about what we use for our service area population. That's basically all of Garfield County. 4 precincts in Eagle County, which is basically the Roaring Fork Valley side of Eagle, and then Glenwood Springs, all the way to approximately Rifle. Now, sometimes we use a little bit more of Garfield County, depending on what we're doing. Sometimes we go as far as Parachute, but 84,000 sounds about right. Now, I know I've heard that. Well, what's the right number to use? Should we go all the way to Garfield County, all the way to and use all of Eagle County? Or should we go to Parachute? Should we go beyond? What about, should we use all or some parts of Garfield County? I feel for these folks because we do this all the time at RAFTA. It also seems to be like an amoeba here, particularly for airport planning, because if you live. I live in Carbondale, and whenever I want to travel, I look at Eagle Airport. I also look at Aspen Airport, and sometimes look at Grand Junction Airport. So it's really a mess to try and figure out. And if you live in Rifle, for instance, that's you'd probably be more likely to go to Grand Junction, but sometimes you'd go to Aspen. Or maybe if you even live closer to Aspen, if you're going to go to you're still going to be influenced by what's happening at Eagle Airport and Aspen Airport and Grand Junction, and even Denver. I hope I helped here. So basically, I like the idea that it's an amoeba. I feel for these people trying to determine the right population to use and area to use, and I feel for you all that are trying to figure this out as well. So I think it's really hard to define, and I hope I helped here. And I'll shut up now, except for to say thanks again, Gabe.
Blue microphone side, back in the back.
I'm Phil Holstein. I'm on the technical committee. One of the factors which I haven't heard discussed at all, which I think affects traffic at the airport and population and the amount of visitors in town, is the very high cost of living in this valley, and the very high cost of skiing and coming here for a visit. as the cost goes up, obviously less and less people can afford it. And it's gotten now so that you have to be fairly well-to-do to afford to ski with a family here, given the cost of the lift ticket and the food and the overnight accommodations. Our average hotel room is $300 to $400 a night. Certainly not middle America. And I haven't heard anything involving the steady increased cost of being here, living here, and visiting here in terms of population. There's people moving out. Some people more well-to-do are moving in. But you certainly haven't taken that into account at all, as I can tell.
No, go ahead.
Well, I think, I think as we watch it, I don't know, it's interesting. I mean, I understand that perspective, but it seems like it never, the costs have gone up and up and up. And then when we look back in time and we look at the growth rates, it's continued to grow. Like somehow there are people that can afford it. I don't know what, and we were talking about cost per square foot for construction. When I was doing research here as a graduate student, the most expensive price per square foot anybody had ever heard of was going up in Owl Creek, some house in Owl Creek. It was $850 a square foot. Right now people are laughing about it. $850 is like a good deal. It's like a bargain for institutional construction now. But it just doesn't, I don't know. I mean, maybe there is some point where it's so ridiculously expensive that demand stops. But the rate of absorption of demand, in terms of new people coming in, lodging visitors, it's pretty slow. I think if it was cheaper here, it might be, and there was more supply, there might be more folks, but it does seem like the customers keep showing up here one way or another. And I feel that there maybe is a threshold point, but I would have said that with $850 per square foot, 20 some years ago. But now it's like $1,500. That's the number I heard around the table this morning, is like $1,500 is now what a real luxury home goes for, $1,500 a square foot. So I don't know when we get there, but I agree there must be some threshold.
We also have to remember that we're talking about understanding the growth in in-plane passengers. And we have actually analyzed a cost factor in terms of the cost of travel, how much the ticket costs, to the passenger. And that is one of the critical determinants of whether people take a trip. We also are at somewhat of a disadvantage in that we can look at the personal income of this region as a measure of how well the region is doing. And because the region depends on visitors, the more visitors, more economic activity, higher per capita incomes. But there are a lot of people outside of this region who have a lot of money to spend. And the fact that we're seeing passenger traffic growth continue to increase in the face of some pretty high fares, tells you something about people's sensitivity to paying to come here.
I'm going to go to Orange on the left. It's you.
For a moment, forgetting the economics of everybody here and what it costs to build, you really haven't addressed the physical constraints of the airport, especially the one-way in and opposite direction out. Could you give me an idea, and this is probably a question for you, John, if you have a perfect day, whether you're in a Cessna 210 or a MAX 8, whatever the plane is, what is the the idea of separation. What would be the maximum number, safe number, for in and out of the airport? Would it be 90 aircraft in, 90 aircraft out? What would your estimate be of that absolute limit?
Thanks, John. As I understand, it's 32 an hour. So whether you want to bring 16 in and 16 out, or any math that you want to get to in terms of whether you want to favor the arrivals or favor the departures. So split it down the middle. So if it's 16 in and 16 out, and that, as I understand it, would have to be just perfect conditions. And if you were to do that between 7 a.m. and 11 p.m., how many hours in the day is that? 16 times 32. Tom Sitch is on it. He's cranking the numbers. 512 in a day. But would that be sustainable? I haven't seen a day like that. But even cut that in half and go to 256. So 256 to 300, and even then that would have to be a pretty special day to get those numbers in. But that's basically the flow rate under just perfect conditions.
John, what is a peak day in operations right now?
Peak day in operations right now, if you take us up to 48 flights, and does anybody know Jonathan Jones, who I'm not going to call out back there with Atlantic Aviation, the FBO? How many, on a really peak busy day, how many operations do you see in a peak day? 120, and then operations for us, double it, a flight is actually equals 2, so 80, so 200 is really a peak day for us. Yes. Jonathan, were yours flights or ops? I would assume ops. Yeah, in and out.
Okay.
Can you add one more thing
yeah.
to that, John? It's not so much the airspace, but the ramp space. What is the limiting factor? Why don't you see more?
Part of it's the limiting factor is parking, and then that just depends on how many, what percentage is remaining overnight, how many are coming in just for a few hours, how many are dropping and going, so there's no room at the end in terms of parking at the ramp. You can still get operations in here because they'll drop the passengers off, basically turn right around and then fly and reposition the aircraft to Greeley or Centennial or Front Range or Rifle or Grand Junction, a multitude of airports. So you can also put that factor in there as well. But the 250, 260, that's probably pretty close to what really a peak day is for us. So
We're on this side.
Hi, Jeff Bay with the Experience Committee. I just had a point of clarification, maybe for John or even for Bill, even though you're not on the panel. For the diversions, and I know there's a lot of concern around that, but I just want to clarify, if I buy a ticket from Houston to Aspen and I'm diverted to Denver, the airline has a contractual obligation to get me to Aspen. It may be the next day, but I'm not permanently stuck in Denver. I'm going to be inconvenienced, but I'm ultimately going to make it here. So I think statistically, it's probably 95% of those people, if not all of them, ultimately make it to Denver, whether they choose to drive on their own that night or wait to be flown the next day, correct?
Yes.
Well, is it a mechanical? Is it an act of God? Is it weather delay? Is it flight crew timeout? There's a multitude of reasons, and what's the responsibility of an airline? Not in all cases. The airlines have gone above and beyond, which adds to the operating cost. Very unique to this airport is the busing operation, the Plan B, if you will. That was created just before I got here. In fact, I think Bill Tomsich and company were really putting together with the Hotelier Association to how do we make the experience of getting people when they are diverted at such high numbers to Grand Junction, or what accommodations could be made to get them up here from Denver. So there's that component to it, but again, there's a variety of responsibilities that the airlines have to cover, and others that you're just having a bad day and you're on your own.
John, that's a great segue to a couple of data points I wanted to offer here. One in response to your question here, Jeff, which is about the employment data that Linda had presented here. And I'm very familiar with that data. I've really gotten my fingers dirty with it, and I can tell you that the employment data actually represents true emplaned passengers boarded at the Aspen airport. Deplaned, which would be the opposite, would be inbound arriving passengers that actually arrived at the Aspen airport. In almost all cases, if there's a diverted flight to Grand Junction or if they get dumped in Denver, those would be counted as deplanements at those other airports. There's actually quite a disparity at our airport of inbound deplanements versus outbound enplanements this year, and it happened during the month of March, where we had record snow this year, the snowiest March ever, according to the city of Aspen, and certainly at the airport. And to answer another question that came up earlier, the completion rate of commercial flights that month was 88.1%. So there were over 100 flights that were either canceled or diverted during the month of March, and that is actually the lowest completion rate that I've been tracking here for the last 5 years because it coincided with the snowiest month. On average, the airlines are completing about 95% of their flights during the winter months, and we actually had 2 months earlier this summer in August and September where 100% of the scheduled flights were actually completed. But anyway, to answer the question that wasn't quite clarified before, all the data that Linda presented represent actual and plane passengers who actually boarded at the Aspen airport.
Thank you. This side, orange.
Hi, I'm Mike. I'm on the technical working group. I'm having a little trouble just reconciling, getting away from the population number, the pillow count. So the airlines and commercial operations, particularly the airlines, have pretty much maximized. I think you commented 48, between 45, 48 flights per day. So if they have maximized what they can do as far as bringing the people here, how many more people can we put in beds? Like, if we're full and we don't have any more beds, and I guess my question is directed more towards the planning, the zoning planning, what is the forecast for the number of beds over the next 5 to 10 years? And should that be a factor in projecting growth in operations at the airport?
I have a scope of work, and I'm only partway through it at this phase of the project. So, so we may be able to answer this to some degree. There's still some weaving back and forth between what's going on at the airport and the bed base, but that's also a moving target. Like we talked about RBOs, they just kind of came starting in 2014, just like went from a couple hundred to a couple 2,000-3,000 real quick over a couple years. So that's a fluid market that we have yet to really 100% understand what direction that's going to go in the future. But we are going to look at the lodging that is the planning term is in the pipeline. So approved on some level, but not yet built. And ultimately at some point, connect the dots between the forecasts and the future lodging that has yet to be built. So we've seen what's happened with supply over the past several years. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of dynamic, units getting gained here, units lost here, but the outcome is kind of flat. But we are going to inform that one part of it, where we're going to really try and track down with City of Aspen, okay, what's approved, how many, what's the net gain in lodging units that we might be able to see in the future. But one of the really important points that that I think it's important to remember is that a lot of the overnight visitation here is drive-to, especially in the summer. That peak summer, you've got plane employments that are pretty low. I mean, they're a little bit higher during the off season, but your main employments are coming in the winter, and that's actually overall it's a longer peak, but it's a less intense peak than in the summer. So there's a lot there's a lot going on there in terms of the relationship between what's going on at the, with emplanements and the lodging. I don't think it's a direct one-to-one correlation because people can drive here, and a lot of, I think a lot of, especially in the summer, people fly into DIA, rent a car for pretty cheap. I mean, you can get cheap car rentals out there, and then they just go on a loop. They go to Winter Park and they come up here and they go down to Salida and go rafting, and so I think there's a lot of that going on. Maybe a little bit more focused visitation in the winter. I mean, that's what the data that we have so far says, is that winter traffic at the airport is pretty consistent, and it kind of matches what we're showing with our hotel occupancy. But I don't know that we'll ever all the way get there, in terms of if this many more flights, then this many more beds. I don't know. I mean, we could fabricate it, but I think it's something that we're, even with this analysis that we're going to do, we're going to be able to point out general relationships, but maybe never really be able to sort of create a formula that says this is what the exact relationship is, because people can drive in their cars and they can fly into other airports and get here other ways. Was that on target?
Whether they drive or whether they fly, there's still a maximum number of people that you can fit in our community, whether it's here or Carbondale or Basalt hotels, whatever it is. There's a maximum number of beds, so that's the most that you can fit here. So what I'm driving at is you could probably go to the zoning department and say, okay, what is zoned for a hotel or a future multi-stay use, and say, okay, let's put that factor into the growth factor for people actually coming here, whether they drive or fly. Yeah, I mean, you could do those ratios, but certainly there's got to be an inventory of zoned units in town to be able to predict, okay, are we going to be flat with the number of pillows for the next 20 years? Or are we going to increase by, let's say, 10% and use that into your model for planning?
Well, I think that there are tiers of increasing uncertainty that we can talk about. So the least uncertain that we can be is units that have been approved that are not built. But we know how that goes. Like, things can get approved here and never get built, or drag on for 15 years before they finally are in a form that where they do get built. So we can do that. We can say, okay, this is the most certainty we have. We think these things are approved, and we think this is how many units it represents. Beyond that, it's build-out analysis, and we do have some data about that, but the uncertainty about what's going to happen in this community in terms of future development is high. That's a high level of uncertainty.
Go to Blue down here.
Evan Marks, Focus. I'm hopeful you can answer this question. In your TAF projection for commercial aviation going out 20 years, can you tell us what aircraft you projected, particularly in the last 10 years, and whether or not those aircraft were with wingspans greater than 95 feet and up to 150,000 pound maximum landing weight?
First of all, those aren't my forecasts. Those are the FAA's forecasts, terminal area forecasts, and they do not provide the specific assumptions that you're asking for. We will do that in our forecasts. You have to understand that the way the FAA does the terminal area forecast is they take the nation, they break it into regions. They're top-down forecasts. They don't build them from the bottom up, as we will do here, understanding what markets will be served, what aircraft will be used. They only have so many staff. Basically, it's a staff issue. They do it for the major airports, but they don't do it for the smaller airports. They basically allocate the demand by region, then by group of airports. So unfortunately, no, I can't answer that. But we will look at that and make assumptions based on what the aircraft airlines are using here, what they have in their fleet, what they expect to get in their fleet, how they phase out aircraft, As I mentioned in the presentation, there are more than 130 airports have lost service because aircraft like the 9-seat turboprop, the 19-seat turboprop are no longer in the fleet. So those are the types of things we have to look at. Yeah.
Thank you. Evan, also, someone was telling me today on the team, Mike, that the SCC filings by the airlines, that they actually have listed the 175 for their future aircraft type. That's Group 3, but what's the seating capacity on that one?
76.
76. That's in there, but then also we have heard from the airlines, generally speaking, if they were able to bring in the larger aircraft, they probably would do it during the peak periods of time. But some of the other airlines, such as Delta, who has the Airbus 220, so we would love to be able to bring that aircraft in all the time, which I think would be the perfect aircraft from the community's perspective to serve this airport. A little bit larger than a regional jet of today, but smaller than a 737 and have the capability to go coast to coast. So Delta has those in their fleet now. We'll be reaching out to them soon. Based on talking to John and Jackie and Meg in terms of the Vision Committee chair, pilot, co-pilot, navigator. But there's been some discussion from them of why don't we bring some of these aircraft in so the community can see them. So there's some things in motion to get more clarity on your question specifically, since it has been so elusive for a while. And then also, I believe it's July is the meeting when the airlines are going to be coming back to us and specifically have representatives here, and we have asked them, crunch the numbers, come prepared to tell the community what type of aircraft you're proposing to use.
Over back,
Yeah,
Cindy.
Cindy Hubin. I just had a question, a follow-up on John Kinney's response, I think, to John McBride's question about the 200 potential aircraft that could come and go on a daily basis. Was that commercial, or did that include commercial and general aviation?
In terms of the math, when I was answering John's question, both. Commercial and
total operations.
Okay.
Total ops, yeah.
Thank you.
Lou's side.
Thank you. Tom Melbrick, I'm on the Vision Committee. It was presented in the first meeting or presentation that the widening of the airport would allow for direct flights from Miami, New York, Newark, and Boston. That we would then go from a regional airport to a hub airport. And I can't get my arms around why that wouldn't be significant growth impacts on our community. And I wonder if you would address that, Linda. Thank you.
We're not going to be.
Can I take the first? Sure. The question was asked of me, what are the different classifications of airports? And we talked about different volumes in terms of enplanements. And there's primary, there's non-hub, there's small hub, medium hub, and large hub. It's kind of a crazy phraseology that the FAA is using, because then the airlines use that as a form of a business model, the hub and spoke. So then I think quickly folks grabbed onto that, we're now going to become a hub and people are going to be flying into here, connecting, and then going to somewhere else. Apples and oranges, even though the same phrase is being used. So if you look at us as a non-hub and we were to go into a small category, drop the word hub, that's what was trying to be described there. So it's not so much that we're going to turn into a hub, but if our volumes continue to go and you stay at the volumes that we're at today for one more year, we will go up in a classification. And what that does is it changes some security requirements. We have more security, also creates some opportunities for funding. So it's just a classification of how much volume does this airport accommodate in terms of passengers. So that's the hubbing. So I'm glad you asked that. It gave us an opportunity to clarify. Does that make sense?
Thank you, John. I appreciate that clarification. My real question, though, is again growth. This community has been concerned about growth since the 70s. Taken a number of different steps to try to curtail it with zoning. But the expansion of the airport, and when you have direct flights from the most populated part of our country, having direct flights into, especially people from Miami in the summertime getting here and to experience our summers. It just seems like a no-brainer that we would have a lot of growth associated with the new direct flights. And I believe our winter ski experience can be accommodate more growth. We don't have a lot of lift lines, and if we get them, we can go from 4-packs to 6-packs or et cetera. But our trailheads are full right now, and we really don't have the opportunity to create more trails into the wilderness or our bike paths, et cetera. And so to once again try to get my arms around what our community would like to be like in 30 years, how much growth do we want to have in the summer months is my big question. And with the direct flights from the most populated part of our country, it seems to me that is a growth generator, the biggest growth generator we could possibly have in our Roaring Fork Valley is to widen the airport to allow the direct flights.
So that was your second question, or maybe it was your
Thank
first.
you.
I might have reverted,
No,
but
that was my second.
to the Miami. So I'll answer that from an aircraft perspective and then hand that off to the group. But the context that comment has been made originally by this effort up here, it really boils down to the question to you: what level of service do you want in your community? And that's really a question that's on the table for you to wrestle with, but you're probably looking for more data before you make that determination. In the context of the connectivity between Miami and Aspen or New York or Seattle or San Diego, if you go to a full Group 3 design, we're already Group 3 today, but we have a limitation of 95 feet on our wingspan. So as this aircraft retires and the new aircraft come online, the majority of them, not all, but the majority of them have a wingspan that will put you completely into a full Group 3 design. That's why the FAA wants us to move the runway taxiway to get that separation. The EM-175, Embraer 175, could not make it year-round from here to the different coast. So there are some types of aircraft that you may get into this airport that may not provide that level of service. The CS-100, but now has been purchased by Airbus, so the Airbus 220, it could go to Miami, it could serve New York nonstop, or Seattle or San Diego, or many places in Canada, and even down in the very top of South America. So it has the range, but it's a smaller aircraft. So it was more in the context of these are the different ranges and new generations of regional jets that are coming online that could provide that level of service if that's what the community wants. But Group 3 also potentially could also mean the 737 and the Airbus A319 type aircraft that many in this room have voiced concern about. So until we hear from the airlines, what specifically are you proposing to do with your aircraft types into this airport, we don't know. So it's really a question back to the community: what service level do you want? But we realize you don't have all the data to make that decision yet. And hopefully that answered your question.
What I would add to that, too, is that I mentioned load factors earlier in my presentation. That's the percent of seats that are occupied on average. The load factors at Aspen are are low. They're in the 60 to 70% range. In order to operate a larger aircraft from here to Miami or wherever, you would have to have the passengers to fill it. The overall average load factor for the U.S. as a whole is 84%. So it gets to a point where the economics don't work for an airline to provide that service. They might be able to work during peak season if they're providing a flight. But Aspen is not going to be a connecting hub. They're not going to be, the concentration of flights. It's an O&D airport. There are a lot of airports throughout the United States, like Aspen, that provide service to spokes. And frankly, that's how airlines make money. They feed their hubs, and they radiate the passengers out. And if they can provide the service to Miami through Denver or through Houston, that's the way they'll do it. United in particular right now is trying to build out its mid-continental hubs, Denver, Chicago, Houston, And they're doing it with regional aircraft that feed those hubs, not by providing nonstop service directly to point to where the people want to go, because that works for them. The more activity they feed through that hub, the more money they make. Does that help? You gave up.
Orange on that side.
Frida Wallison, the Community Character Committee. And this may not have anything to do with community character, but we've had a lot of conversation necessarily about the other airports in our area. Rifle, Grand Junction, Eagle, maybe there is one in Glenwood, General Aviation, I'm not sure. And so my question is this an isolated exercise? Are those other airports also looking at the same questions? And are we talking with the other airports about how they view our exercise?
Why don't you begin with their forecasts, and then we'll go to talking with them.
I'm sorry?
Well, those are commercial carrier airports too. They have to deal with the TAF, and they have forecasts just, at least the commercial carrier airports.
Yeah,
do.
it's every airport, as I said, has a forecast prepared by the FAA that they have to reconcile with. I don't know what the other airports are doing right now for planning or forecasting, but for the approval of the forecast, it has to be specific to this airport. I mean, if there's something going on outside that we need to consider, yes, but typically not. I don't know, John.
Did you hear the question? Yes, thank you. Grand Junction is building a parallel runway. They're hoping to build a terminal building. Eagle is building a new terminal building, expanding their existing one, and a variety of other infrastructure facilities. Glenwood Springs is, I understand, in a debate right now whether they're going to continue with their keeping their airport open due to the residential encroachment. Rifle Airport, I'm not sure what's going on there. John has an update on that, and yeah. So.
Yeah, Rifle was probably the one most within the at least transportation area. So we have had preliminary conversations with my peer and such to understand whether right now they are general aviation. They have no commercial service at Rifle. We did have a conversation about whether they were intending to look at commercial service or whether that would be of interest. It was an idea that was floated when we first started these conversations, and they had made very clear to us that they were not interested in pursuing commercial service, but that they would like to have further conversations about general aviation, because we do have a lot of general aviation that right now, frankly, because of ramp space and such here, is going to Rifle. And those discussions will be happening in the future here, so we'll keep you updated.
And I think it's a great question to pose to the airlines when they come here in July, the second week of July. What are their plans for Aspen, Eagle, and Grand Junction, and any other airport, Montrose? And how does that fit into the system? And just ask them any of those variables. We provide the field, they pretty much bring the game, but they do it on more of a regional level. So.
Okay, it is 7 o'clock, so I know there's at least one more question, so I think we'll take that one. And I am going to also indicate that, again, like ever, we always allow written questions. So if you didn't get to your question tonight, respecting your time, send it in, and we're going to send it to the experts and get an answer just like any of the other questions we've gotten. So we don't want to leave any question unanswered at the end of the day. So,
okay.
Blue side.
A question I have is when you have flights canceled because of the bad weather or whatever here, do you make arrangements for the people to go by bus to Denver or to Grand Junction Airport, or are they responsible for finding their own way?
That's primary and airline responsibility if they have the obligation to do so. Otherwise, it's really the relationship of the passenger with the airline, and they'll find their way. But yeah, airports do not get into that aspect of the businesses. Same with the rental cars as well. I'm not sure of an airport that does
Okay,
in the
I'm gonna
entire
take
nation. So,
At least one more question, because Rich is raising his hand. Up, I see there. Orange.
Kirk with the community committee. Question about the SkyWest. It looks like a monopoly here. So you showed, I think, 4 different airplanes. Can all 4 of those service Aspen, or just one of those with the current restrictions of the 95 feet wingspan?
Just the CRJ 700.
Yeah. Yes. So but I want to repeat the question because I'm not sure everyone heard it. I think the question was, there were 4 aircraft shown that are operated by SkyWest, and the question was, can all of those aircraft, or which of those aircraft can currently operate into Aspen with our current configuration? And I believe the CRJ 700 is still, and the CRJ 200, both of those would potentially be able to operate here. The CRJ, the 200 can't, just the 700. The CRJ 700 is the only one of those aircraft right now. I don't know if it has the operating characteristics to come in here. The 900 was the question.
right. Yes, sir.
And additionally, looking at the potential of longer haul flights to Miami or whatnot. Again, since SkyWest is the only real operator here, is there a limitation as far as their footprint? Do they actually service other airports, or do they just service the ones we currently have access to?
Pretty much the ones that are served here. Each airline has their own regional partner, and they cover different parts of the United States. And SkyWest has kind of the Rocky Mountain West Coast region. You call it a monopoly, but their agreements differ with each of the major airlines they serve. They have different conditions. And obviously, they want to be successful in their contracts, so they do whatever to keep the level of service high. But yeah, I mean, the regional carriers serve the hubs, pretty much, and that's it.
Okay. Realizing again it's 7 o'clock and we're past time. Any other questions? Can info@ascvision.com, and we will certainly get to those questions and answer those in writing. The other thing to highlight is that we've about a third of the way through the process right now, and we're going to ask we're actually going to email each of you to take a quick survey just to understand how this process is going, any improvements that we can make to the process. Are we going too fast, going too slow? Information that you may want to see that you have not gotten yet. We're trying to continually improve this process for you and make sure that we're giving you the information that you need. So when you get the email, please take the survey. It won't take very long at all. And we'll hopefully improve the process as a result of that feedback. So with that, thank you very much for your time.